Good afternoon or good morning. I would like to welcome everybody to today's webinar from Astrix Technology Group entitled Don't Throw Your LIMS Away, 5 Tips for Saving Your Implementation and Your LIMS Investment. Today's session, we're going to go through a brief agenda and then get into a couple of quick introductory slides before we begin today's presentation, which again is being recorded for your convenience and will be made available to everybody following the session today. So with the agenda, welcome and introductions, which we've covered already, we're going to talk a little bit about Astrix Technology Group, who we are, why we believe we've got the right to be speaking to you about these topics today. And then we're going to talk a little bit about why organizations find the need to rip and replace their LIMS system. We're going to talk a little bit about an evaluation of the 5 steps on how to avoid a replacement of your investment and go through some case studies on how we've dealt with this in the past. As I mentioned in the beginning, we will make time allotment for Q&A. As we go through today's session, we encourage you to ask as many questions as you like in the GoToWebinar panel, and then when we get to the end of the session, we'll read the questions out and attempt our best to answer them. We will not read your name, and we will not read your email address. Next slide, please. So briefly, before we get our presenter on, a little bit about Astrix Technology Group. First and foremost, we're an informatics professional services and staffing company that is dedicated 100% to serving the scientific community, and we'll go through the different areas within the scientific community that we work with routinely. However, some quick statistics to go over about the company. It was originally established in 1995. Today, it is still a privately held company, but it had originated as the IT division of a company called APBI, which was a $300 million life science research organization. Today, we proudly operate from 8 offices around the globe and have over 500 employees. The headquarters in the United States, we hail from Red Bank, New Jersey. And basically, the way Astrix breaks out is in 2 distinct parts. Number one, there's a staffing division, which offers both private sector as well as public sector staffing, predominantly around scientific and IT resources. There's also a professional services division. That's the division that is presenting today's webinar, which is focused on supporting science-based organizations in a variety of different ways, mostly around helping with the evaluation, the selection, operation, and management of scientific software used in a laboratory. The type of clients that we work with, life science enterprises, government and research institutions, typically with large and fast-growing IT, staffing, and compliance needs. As always, our mission is to deliver scalable, sustainable solutions in IT and staffing for the scientific community. So industries that we deal with and the technology partners that we work with to help deliver these solutions. First and foremost, we deal with companies that operate in very highly regulated workflows and integrations, and we provide a best-of-breed approach to all of the solutions that we put in place. And if you go ahead and hit the key so we can build that out. So first and foremost, the different industries that we're working in. Obviously, from a regulated industry point of view, these should be pretty common sense. We deal heavily in pharmaceutical and biotech, but also personal care, consumer products, cosmetics, petrochemical, specialty chemical, and of course some of the other areas like environmental services, food and beverage, flavors and fragrances, and medical device. The technology partners and platforms that we work with, it's a who's who in the technology space for the scientific community: Thermo, Waters, StarLIMS, Dotmatics, LabWorks, CoreLIMS, and LabVantage. These are all the leaders in their respective categories of technology that are used by the scientific community. And Astrix leverages these technologies. We work with these technologies, and it ranges from implementation to vendor selection to training to ongoing configuration work, etc., to managed services. So we're heavily involved with all these technologies, helping to deliver great solutions to our customers in these different industries. Next slide, please. So we're very lucky and pleased to have a gentleman by the name of Robert Walla is going to be taking us through today's presentation. Robert is a principal and co-founder of Astrix Technology Group. Overall, he's responsible for the growth and direction of the professional services division. He brings with him a wealth of experience over 20 years in the lab informatics space, including overseeing very large global informatics projects, and he brings with him a bachelor's in chemistry from Rutgers University. So Rob, we're going to welcome you on and let you take it from here.
Kevin, thank you very much. And again, welcome everybody. Good morning and good afternoon. Before we get started, just cover a little bit about what you can expect today. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about steps that you can take to save your investment. And we'll talk about some common reasons and why companies implement a LIMS, but then they look to possibly replace it. And, but more importantly, what can be done to correct the problems and avoid a replacement, and, why that would be important. And we'll talk about a couple of real-world examples as well. And as Kevin had mentioned, then open up for Q&A at the end. But before we get started, I think we're going to have our first poll of the day, and we're going to have several of these throughout the presentation, just to get an understanding of where you are with your LIMS and some of the issues that you may be facing. So Kevin, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, it always is helpful for us to get an understanding of who we're talking to. So, one of the first things we want to do is we want to get an understanding of who you are, at least from your role in the organization. So we'll leave the poll open for just a moment here. If you could select whether you're a lab analyst, a LIMS user, admin, laboratory manager, or executive within the organization, that would be super helpful. Again, we can kind of look at the results and then tailor some of the messages and then hopefully some of the Q&A when we get to the end to match up with the predominance of positions. So we'll go ahead and keep this open for about 5 more seconds. And then we'll go ahead and close this out. All right, and we'll go ahead and share those results with everybody so everybody understands. So predominantly we've got LIMS user administrator, followed by a laboratory manager and then lab executive, and then we have lab analyst pulling up the 4th place. So we appreciate your participation in that. We'll go ahead and close that out and let Rob pick it back up, and I think we'll have a few more as we go through the session today. Rob, it's back to you.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay, before we talk about the replacement and what you can do to avoid that, when we talk a little bit about the path of a LIMS implementation, kind of the LIMS journey. And usually what it starts with, and if you've been through this before, you know this, it usually starts with a pain or a problem that you're having within your laboratory. Whether it's up production or an efficiency or doing reporting or whatever it may be. Usually the path of a LIMS journey starts with a problem or a pain and the identification that you do need a LIMS system. So in order to get that process going, typically there's a lot of group discussions. If maybe a person or a group of people had identified this need, they'll bring other people and start talking about it and say, hey, we could really solve some of our problems if we had a LIMS system, and here's some of the advantages of doing that. And that will go on for some period of time. And then maybe, even before management is approached, there may be some consensus building amongst groups. So if you're working in, a specific area of the laboratory, they say, hey, before we talk to management about this, maybe we'll check with the other folks next door and see if they're having similar problems. And maybe we can approach, management and executive team together and build a little consensus for this. And eventually that does work up to management, where there are meetings to discuss, some of the benefits and, what would be the return on investment. And all right, we're going to invest a lot of time and money. What would we get out of it? So, there are certainly, it starts off with management discussions, which then leads into obviously more management discussions, because typically you're not going to get the approval right away, or many organizations don't. So, this is an iterative process that you go through. But eventually it will get down to a justification where management will say, okay, this sounds like a good idea. Can you put a business case together? Get us some numbers. Let's see if it's going to make sense for us in order to go down that purchasing path. And then most likely you're not going to be on your budget cycle, so you'll have to go through that period and wait for the next time that money is available. And then eventually approval will happen, and you guys will get a notice to proceed. Now, the timing of this obviously will depend on organizations and how big you are and the processes and number of people that you have. But usually to get to this stage, so to go from the initial we need a LIMS to okay, we have the approval to go start that process, it could be considerable time. We have heard it could be 12 to 24 to 36 months where people are talking about it, internal discussions before they actually start down that road. So at this point, you're at that evaluation and selection phase. And whether you decide to do that internally or a third party, totally up to you. There are many, many steps that go into this before you're ready to start your implementation. So there's the typical requirements. So we've got approval for a LIMS, what do we want it to do specifically? And that's going to take a lot of internal time, or if you decide to engage a third party, obviously monetary resources as well. There'll be process evaluations and discussions. Do we want to continue to do things the way we're doing, or do we want to maybe harmonize between different groups, or look to streamline some of our processes before we do that implementation? And then you're at a stage where you can start to identify potential LIMS vendors, and there's a variety of different ways you can do it, again, whether you're doing it internally or using a third party. But eventually you're going to get into conversations with vendors, meetings, product demonstrations, maybe more than one, where you're evaluating their solutions. And at this point you're meeting with multiple vendors, anywhere between 2, 3, 4, and 5 that we've seen. But as you start to move down that path and really hone in on select a vendor, you get into the procurement process, contract negotiations, and then eventually, the implementation of a LIMS system, which, averages about 12 months. If you attended any of our other webinars where we talked about, the implementation of LIMS and the processes to do that, we've always say somewhere between 6 to 9, 6 to 12, possibly 18 months to implement the LIMS, depending on the organization, the complexity. So basically, it is a long period of time. From when you first identified the need to a LIMS, you're in the 2 to 3 year time frame typically, and the cost, depending on the organization, certainly in the hundreds of thousands, to over $1 million. And this is out-of-pocket expense. If you really wanted to take a total cost perspective and look at time people are spending with the meetings and management time, it certainly would be way above that. But it really, what I'm trying to point out here is that a lot goes into the evaluation, selection, approval of a LIMS, and then obviously the implementation. So what's typically the results of a LIMS system? Well, if you've attended our previous webinars, you know that about half of them fail. And really, what does that mean? A lot of different ways to approach that, but typically get implemented without all of the required functionality. And the project did not meet the targeted goal and objectives that the company originally set out to achieve. So that's kind of the high level way of evaluating it, but what do really users say when LIMS get implemented? How is it being evaluated within the organization? What are users' experience when they start to use a new system? And we hear a variety of different things. Typically, first and foremost, what we hear is that it's not user-friendly. When we are brought in to companies to evaluate LIMS that may be not working properly, it's usually the first thing that we hear. The system is not user-friendly. And as we start to dive down a little bit deeper, we usually get the terms like, well, it's clunky. I guess that's better than it's not user-friendly to a certain extent, but still doesn't really tell you a lot about why the system isn't working. But this is from a user perspective. This is their perspective. But again, as you start to talk through, all right, well, tell me specifically, what are some of your issues? Here are some of the top ones we always hear. Can't do all of my tests in it, which means that maybe it didn't get built out to the fullest extent for a variety of reasons. I still need to write data on paper. Very, very common. Even though they have LIMS systems and there may be integrations that were done to a certain extent, we often see that paper is still in the laboratory, and even in very, very important parts of the processes where a user could be using the LIMS, then we'd have to go off on paper and then come back to the LIMS system. I need to enter my data manually, which usually leads and indicates that a system may not have been fully integrated, or there are processes there that are disconnected from the LIMS system, and it requires extra time to get that data into it. Here's one that always baffles me a bit is I still need to use a calculator. If one thing that LIMS systems, or I guess IT systems in general, are pretty good at, are taking a couple of numbers and adding them or multiplying them together. But that does require some configuration. And if that hasn't been done, it is not uncommon, and we've seen it happen, where Somebody will be using the LIMS, they'll be looking at numbers on the LIMS screen, and they'll be punching it into a calculator or into Excel, to complete the process. I need to access too many screens. And when you really think about it, prior to using a LIMS system, if people haven't used it before, they've been in lab notebooks. And, everything is right there. They can write down what they want. It's always right in front of them. When you get into an IT system, especially a LIMS system, a lot of times you have to move from screen to screen to screen. And if your workflows aren't designed properly, sometimes that gets to be, very, very, very involved and slows down the process. And, the old Roach Motel issue here is I can't get data out of it. I can get data in sometimes, but I cannot get data out easily. And it really gets to an issue where, they can't generate reports, or data cannot be, or the process not be moved to the next step because data is not easily accessible. And really, when you sum all of this up, LIMS systems have high expectations. People get very excited about it in the beginning. They see it as a way to streamline the process, remove a lot of manual processes, and make their life easier. But often what happens, and you can see from some of these comments, many of which are, we hear all the time, it really turns into daily frustrations. So, what do people look to do next? Often, the logical step seems like, well, let's just get rid of it and we'll start over. Okay, this isn't working, we've tried, but for some reason, this maybe just not be for us. And it seems like a logical step because people say, well, it'll be a fresh start for us. Okay, we'll kind of clear the decks, and we'll get a new system in here and it'll be much better. And we're not going to get into this situation again, is because we'll do it better the next time. We've learned from this. And there may be some truth to that, but really when you look at it, there's been a considerable investment made to this point, both in people's time and certainly money. And, I always take a look at this, and we have conversations with clients, and we say, well, look at personal examples. Take the LIMS out of this, but, what major investments do you make in your personal life? And, obviously a house comes to mind, right? It's probably the biggest personal investment most of us are going to make, or the biggest purchase we'll make in our lifetime. And you do a lot of research, to buying a house like you do with a LIMS, and you look and you evaluate, and you see many of them, and you can draw parallels to the LIMS evaluation process. And hey, you find something you think is going to work, you move in, and it's not uncommon, I think we've all been through this, where maybe just some things aren't the way we thought it was going to be. So for example, maybe your kitchen looks great, and everything seems fine, but then you move in and you just seem like, things just aren't quite right. You're moving all around, your sink isn't close to where you do the prep of your food, and you need to you need to do something a little bit different. Typically what's not done is you don't say, well, my kitchen's not right, I'm just going to go sell the house and start over. If you're in that financial situation, great for you, but most of us are not. So what do? You look at ways maybe to improve that. Okay, so maybe you call your contractor back up and say, it'd be great if I had a sink over here so I don't have to walk across the kitchen. So what we're going to talk about today is, using an analogy of a house is, what can you do, incrementally that could improve your experience with the LIMS, and the steps that you can take, because there are steps that really can be taken to save your investment. But before we get into that, I think, Kevin, you have our second poll of the day.
I do. Let's go ahead and get that launched. And this one is going to talk a little bit about, the status of your current LIMS environment. So we've got currently have a LIMS, and there's no plans to replace it. You currently have a LIMS, and there is a plan to replace it about 6 to 12 months out. There's no LIMS, and you plan to purchase one within 6 to 12 months, and no LIMS and no plans to purchase it. So those are the four choices. It's always obviously helpful to get an understanding of where folks are in their life cycle. So take a moment. We'll leave this open for just a few more minutes here. Give everybody a chance to get their answers in. And with that, we'll go ahead and close that out. So thank everybody for participating. Close it, and let me go ahead and share those results with everybody. So as you can see, pretty even between currently have a LIMS, no plan to replace, currently have a LIMS, and you're thinking about replacing it sometime within the next year, 6 months, no LIMS, and then no LIMS with no plans to purchase. So let's go ahead and close that out. Thank you again for everybody for participating in that. And Rob, we'll go ahead and let you pick it back up from here.
Great, thank you, Kevin. Okay, let's talk through some of these steps. Step one, first of all, characterize really what the problems are. I think you saw from some of those comments that we had on the previous slide, they're very, very, very vague. But there's certainly issues that the users deal with. So the first thing you certainly need to do is make sure you really understand what the problems are. And what we always tell folks is, remove the emotion from the conversation. LIMS have a tendency to be very emotional systems. And I think a lot of it has a tendency to be that they have high expectations and people think it's going to be great, we're getting off of paper, and then when that's not realized, there's a lot of frustrations that come with it. So you really need to remove, what the emotions from the conversation and identify the specific problems, but don't settle for vague terms. If it's clunky, that's fine. Why is it clunky? Can you describe that to me? What do you mean by that? And it's really sitting down with the users and understanding, what the specific issues are. And if you're an experienced, person with LIMS and you've used several of them and you're helping trying to characterize what these issues are, be prepared to guide the users through the problem solving process. And you have to realize many of them may have never used a LIMS before. So it could be difficult for them to articulate what the issues are, and maybe they really don't know. So it could be a situation where you may have to say, okay, you're having problems getting data out. Tell me about that. What do you need to do with the data? What type of data do you need to get out? And really kind of help foster them as they try to describe what the issues are. All of this obviously should be documented, but prepared in a way that can be shared with third parties. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you could use the vendor to potentially solve some of these problems. But you want to make sure that the documentation is clear, everything is described and actionable, and that there's no internal types of jargon that are used that may not be understood. And lastly, set the proper expectations. Certainly, just because you're talking to people and writing it down, documenting, doesn't mean that all of these problems can get solved. So let folks know that we're certainly going to you're going to look at that and see what could be done to solve some of the problems. Second step is evaluate your solutions, and this can be done a couple of different ways. But the best way is to speak with your vendor. And I always make this comment, this assumes that you're still on speaking terms with your vendor. And what I mean by that is, oftentimes when projects end, there could be some contention between a client and the vendor. So if you're not on speaking terms with your vendor, you can certainly get back re-engaged. But I think it's really important to understand the difference between services and support. Now, a lot of clients that we talk to say, well, I'm on a support contract and I need to have these services done, but my vendor says that it's not included. And that is certainly true. Support is for answering questions. If there's bugs with the program, that will be handled. But for additional services, that would be certainly outside the lines of that. So just make sure people in the organization understand what would be covered under support and what would be additional services. Now, as you go through this, working with the vendor, identify both quick fixes and longer-term solutions. And we'll talk about this, but typically there are some quick fixes that can be done that would make a very, very big difference in the lives of the people that are using the LIMS. And split those out so that you can put a plan together to identify those and do the quick fixes. And then as you have time and you have budget, you can do more of the longer-term solutions. Longer-term solutions can take on a variety of different views. Typically it is additional integration. If you've done integration at all, a lot of the times, a lot of the issues that people see is because integration have not been done at all. Instruments weren't integrated. There wasn't any integration to existing systems. So just doing that would certainly handle some of the issues that people are seeing. Visualization tools or reporting tools are another longer-term solution potentially that can solve a lot of problems, especially if you're hearing a lot that we cannot get the data out, or I don't know what data is in there, or I can't match up data that's in the LIMS system. And there's a lot of visualization tools out there that would be able to be integrated with a LIMS and solve a lot of issues. Also look for third-party software. It's not uncommon that, people implement LIMS, but then they also implement other software that integrates with LIMS. So for example, most LIMS systems out there have calibration, instrument calibration or instrument maintenance modules, but it's not really a core function of a lot of LIMS systems. So if that's an area that's very important to the organization, that may not work to the level that you need it to in the LIMS system, but there are plenty of third-party software packages out there that do that functionality specifically, and maybe implementing something like that and integrating with the LIMS could alleviate a lot of problems. And lastly, seek assistance from a third party. If the situation with your vendor is, I guess, maybe beyond repair, there are companies out there, Astrix is one of them, that can help you work through this and, get your plan together, or maybe help you re-engage with your vendor so that you can start to evaluate these solutions. Okay, moving on to step 3. It's the DIY approach, which we're big fans are. Typically, there are quick fixes that can be done that may have been identified in step 2 that you can do internally. And they kind of fall into a couple of different categories. Functionality. So for example, as you've gone through and implemented your LIMS, typically people have attended training courses, and one of the things that they teach you at these training courses is maybe how to implement additional methodologies. So if it's a situation where people are frustrated because not all of the methods or the tests are in there, typically adding a method to a LIMS is not a lot of time or effort, but could certainly solve a lot of problems. Same thing goes with reporting. LIMS systems will come with a lot of basic reports. Some will meet your needs, some won't. But to modify or tailor those a little bit more to your specific needs from a basic reporting perspective, it doesn't take a lot of time either. So, a little effort into the reporting could certainly solve a lot of issues. Basic calculations. I mentioned using a calculator before. LIMS they do calculations very, very, very well if they're configured properly. And again, usually a super user or maybe an admin can certainly configure the LIMS so calculations can be included and alleviate the need for either a calculator or Excel. But it's not all functionality. A lot of times we see a lot of the frustrations because people don't know how to use the LIMS system. And that's from a couple of different perspectives. It's either end user training was not done before the implementation, or new users, new people were hired and brought into the organization and they have not been trained on the system. So something as simple as maybe having and conducting internal training courses, show people how to use the LIMS, maybe the normal workflows and some of the specific workflows would alleviate a lot of the frustrations. And then lastly, process changes. A lot of times we observe that people are continuing to do same process that they had with a manual paper-based system. And a lot of times it seems redundant to users, or people don't know why they need to do that. So evaluate your processes. And if it's a situation where you're printing out and checking because that's what you always did when you're on a paper-based system, maybe some of these can be alleviated. So these systems here, these fixes, they don't require typically a lot of time. Typically they can be done internally without any external investment, but you can get a big bang for your buck. Before we go on to step 4, now that we just talked a little bit about doing it yourself, I think we have a poll that we want to get a little bit of understanding of the expertise that you have internally. So Kevin?
Yeah, and I believe we might have flip-flopped those, so we'll come back to that one in just a moment,
Okay.
Rob. So we have how self-sufficient you are. Touches a little bit on that, but basically what this is talking about is, you're very self-sufficient in that you've got sufficient technical staff that can pretty much do all the work, configure the LIMS, etc. You're somewhat, meaning you've got users that can do some of the simple changes to it, and then you are have none, meaning you have to rely almost 100% on vendor or third-party companies to get the work done within your LIMS. So it's obviously always good to understand, kind of where you fit within this. Obviously tells you how likely you are to, have needs around this. So anyway, we'll leave this open for just another second or two, make sure we get everybody in. I know I've seen a few other responses kind of trickle in, and great. So let's go ahead and close that. And let me share those results with you. So 56% vary. You've got technical staff on site that could do configuration of your LIMS. You've got users that can perform some simple changes, and apologize that cut off. They have length requirements here to these. And then 0% need to rely on a vendor or third-party company. So it seems like kind of 50-50 a little bit between you have some and you're very well set. So we want to thank everybody for participating in that one.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Okay, moving on. Step 4. Once you go through your quick fixes, develop a plan to implement the rest of your solutions. Obviously, take a phased approach because you could have many options there with your integration, as well as a variety of maybe different tools that you could use. It's always good as you start to do this to outline the benefits, because you're eventually going to have to present this, potentially get funding for it. So, as you talk through with the users of, I need this, or I'd like this type of functionality, or we want to do this type of integration, really understand really what you're going to get out of it and what the benefits would be. When you present this to management, highlight your quick fix wins. If you're going to go ask for money to do something a little bit more involved, certainly point out that here's the steps we've taken before we got here. We did training, we used our internal super users and admins, and we reconfigured the system, and here were the benefits of that. So the first step we did is try to do it internally without spending a lot of time and money, but now we're at a point where we really can make a big difference if we go ahead and spend a little money to do that. And then lastly is, so you don't get yourself in this situation again, implement a continuous improvement plan. And it doesn't take a lot in order to do that. Really, it's staying in touch with users or with people in your group. Make it part of your routine meetings, or establish separate ones if you need to. Keep a working document that describes needs and benefits of suggestions and wants of the LIMS system. And keep management informed. I think a lot of times, what we've seen is things get stalled because management gets informed maybe right before a budgeting cycle of, oh, here's all of the money we'd like to spend, or here's some of the things that we'd like to do. But continuous communication with management of saying, hey, we're working with the users. Here's some of the things we're hearing. We're going to document it, and we'd like to speak with you about it. That can certainly go a long way. And establish an annual budget for either a vendor or a third party, as part of your annual budgeting cycle. When you think about, again, going back maybe to a personal real world example, is you buy a car, right? But you certainly budget, or that you're going to have service costs throughout, right? Whether it's oil changes or new tires or whatever it may be, people will always budget for that. It's the same thing, with a LIMS system. Having a budget, and it doesn't have to be a lot of money. I'm not saying you need hundreds of thousands of dollars in order to keep your LIMS running, but a couple of $10,000 every year to bring a vendor in, or to bring a third party in to do a tune-up, maybe do some additional functionality implementations that you can't do, well worth the money. Okay, a little bit about a case study. We had worked not too long ago with a biotech company out on the West Coast, and they implemented a LIMS, and they did it in both of their R&D division as well as their manufacturing division. The way this came about, though, is that it initially started in R&D, and as they started to, after they made the selection, they started to get into the implementation. Someone said, hey, you know what, we should probably bring manufacturing in at this time as well. And really what they found out is that manufacturing found it really difficult to use. They tried the configuration, they got it configured as much as they possibly could with where they were at that time, but just wasn't really working for them. And they kind of broke off a faction. They started down a path to evaluate an alternative. we were engaged with this company, and we did a couple of things. Their relationship with the vendor was okay, not great. We were involved. We started to facilitate meetings between the company, the vendor, and ourselves, and we were able to develop a kind of a couple of phase plan where we first took a DIY approach and outlined some very, very small things that this company was able to do themselves. They didn't need to engage the vendor. They didn't need to engage Astrix. They were able to use internal resources. They got some quick wins. They were able to make some very quick special tweaks to the system that allowed them to gain some efficiencies. And then down the road, they actually did a major integration into their manufacturing execution system that really got them where they needed to be. So they went from a point where they were thinking about throwing the LIMS system out to getting it to a point where they were able to do some internal tweaks to get them to a point where they could use it, and then eventually did a major integration that helped them out tremendously. So before we wrap up, I think, Kevin, you have the last poll for today?
Yes, we do, and actually I don't think we did go out of order the last time, so I think we were okay with that one. So let me go ahead and get this last one launched. So this one talks a little bit about how likely you are to consider hiring a third party to assist with LIMS service. Obviously, this is something that Astrix is deeply involved in, so we love to know if there is help needed, that we're there to help and provide services, etc. So answers being not likely. You got your internal resources, so you're all set. Not likely, we don't have budget. Somewhat likely, and very likely. And we'll leave this open for just a few more moments here before we go ahead and get into some of the Q&A, because I do see some questions have popped up here on the board. Just leave that up for one more sec, and then we'll go ahead and close that out for everybody. Share those results. Okay, not likely at 39%, not likely, no budget, 11%, somewhat likely, 39%. And for the people who are going to get bombarded with sales calls at the end, very likely. No, we're actually just kidding on that. But yes, I want to thank again everybody for participating in our polls. So we'll go ahead and point this back to you, and then I'll start to look at the questions that have been coming across.
That'd be great. Just quickly in review, a couple of some very easy steps that you can take in order to do this. Certainly characterize the problems, really understand what you're dealing with here. I've mentioned before, and I'll reiterate it, when we're brought in and we're speaking with people about why LIMS are working, people are not usually even at that step. We hear a lot of those vague types of answers, and it's very difficult to put action plans together in order to do that. So certainly characterize those, evaluate your solution options. We're a big proponent of staying engaged with your vendor and leveraging your vendor. A vendor knows the product very well. A vendor could typically give you some pretty good pointers that they will not charge for. But if you have a problem, they'll say, well, go into this module and configure it this way, and that can probably do what you need to do. So certainly leverage them. You probably have some resources internally, that understand the LIMS. Utilize them, rely on them to get some quick fixes, and then put a plan in place for some of the more difficult things. And if it's something that you can't do internally, go back out, leverage the vendor, or certainly leverage a third party like Astrix to help you with that. And I think one thing we always say is that a LIMS system is never done. A lot of people think, well, we implemented, maybe we did a little bit of an upgrade, and now it can just kind of go out on its own. Typically not the case. It's always good to put a improvement plan in place. Meet regularly, modify that, and have budget on an annual basis in order to do the tweaks that you need. So with that, we'll wrap up and open up for any questions.
Yeah, and again, I want to encourage everybody, if you haven't asked any questions yet, you're more than welcome to do so. We do have a number that kind of popped up here as we went through today's session. Some of them, as I'm reading through, what I want to make very clear to everybody on the call is that Astrix is vendor agnostic. As you saw from the slide in the beginning, there's a number of different vendors that we have skill sets around. We never go out and just recommend vendors just for the sake of recommending a vendor because we're part of their partner program, etc. So there was a few questions that came up that are very specific to a specific vendor, and I don't want to get into a whole who's better, this vendor or that vendor, because frankly each one is going to have their strengths in their own area. So again, if there's some that are out there, questions about specific LIMS vendors or comparison LIMS vendors, we may not do those publicly, but we'll certainly answer those privately if need be. But one quick question I thought was interesting, let me open this up here, is, and this is for Rob obviously, are there any circumstances when starting over with a net new LIMS is in fact the best approach, and what are some of the telltale signs for that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, there are couple of reasons that we've seen and actually agreed on. There are times where people have implemented a LIMS and that vendor is no longer supporting the LIMS or does not have a plan to come out with new upgrades and continue to support it. So if that is the case, and they've either stopped supporting it and moved on to another business or got out of the LIMS business, and that has happened, then you may want to look at doing a replacement. At that point, you're not going to get new updates. You're not going to be able to extend the LIMS system. So that may be an area where you would want to consider replacing the LIMS. Or, and this is more of an extreme case, but yeah, we've seen it happen where a division of a company has been had a LIMS quote unquote forced on them, and it just does not fit. And maybe an extreme example is if you're a company that has a very, very specialized area, maybe like a next generation sequencing, but there's another division or another separate company that does more QC type of work, and they think that you could take a next generation sequencing LIMS and force it into a QC environment. That typically doesn't work. So if that's ever happened to you, that's most likely one where you're probably going to have to go out and get your own LIMS.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that. We'll have another look here. I'm kind of picking my way through these. It seems like a lot of steps that would take some time. What is a typical time frame?
Put me on the spot. Well, there are a lot of steps, and there's 5 steps, and as you talk through it, they look like it could take some time. However, really when you think about it, to sit down with users and really understand sort of the major ones, and typically there's going to be 4 or 5 really major items that you want to focus on, and there'll be more of that, but that could certainly go to a second tier. Thinking about meeting with